There's a quiet moment that most people overlook. It doesn't arrive with noise or chaos. It comes subtly, almost gently. A small hesitation before a thought feels completely true. A brief pause where something inside you whispers, "Wait, is this really mine?" At first you ignore it, because your thoughts feel familiar. They sound like you. They've been with you for years, shaping your decisions, your reactions, your identity. But familiarity doesn't always mean truth. Sometimes it just means repetition. Think about how many times you've reacted instantly, felt anxious, insecure, angry, without questioning where that feeling came from. It feels automatic, almost programmed. And that's exactly what makes it so convincing. But here's where things begin to shift. What if not every thought you have is actually a reflection of who you are? What if some of them were learned, absorbed, repeated so many times that they became indistinguishable from your own voice? Maybe it started earlier than you realize. Small comments, subtle expectations, moments where you adapted to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid discomfort. Over time, those adaptations became internal, and now they speak as if they are you. That's why this realization feels unsettling, because it doesn't attack your life directly, it questions your perception of it. And once that happens, things don't feel as solid anymore. You begin to notice patterns, the same doubts appearing in different situations, the same fears repeating themselves even when circumstances change. It starts to feel less like reality and more like a script. And if it's a script, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who wrote it? This is where most people turn away. Not because they're incapable of understanding, but because the answer requires something uncomfortable. It requires distance from your own mind. It requires observation instead of immediate belief. And that's not easy, because the moment you stop trusting every thought automatically, you step into uncertainty. But at the same time, something else begins to happen. You gain space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Not a new identity, not a forced change, just clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that quietly changes everything. Once you begin to notice that space, something strange happens. Your thoughts don't stop, but they lose a bit of their authority. They're still there, still speaking, still trying to guide your reactions. But now there's a slight distance between you and them, and that distance changes everything. Before, a thought would appear and immediately become your reality. If your mind said you're not good enough, it didn't feel like a suggestion, it felt like a fact. But now there's a pause, a moment where you can see the thought instead of becoming it. That pause is subtle, but it's powerful, because it reveals something most people never fully realize. Just because something appears in your mind doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't even mean it's useful. Some thoughts are just echoes of past experiences, echoes of things you've heard, believed, or feared. They repeat not because they're accurate, but because they've been reinforced over time, and repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates trust. But trust doesn't always mean accuracy. This is where things can feel confusing, because if you can't automatically trust every thought, then what can you trust? The answer isn't immediate, and that's okay. This isn't about replacing your thoughts with new ones. It's about changing your relationship with them. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin to observe. Instead of believing everything, you start questioning. Not aggressively, not with force, just quietly, like watching clouds pass in the sky. Some are heavy, some are light, some disappear quickly, but none of them define the sky itself. In the same way, your thoughts don't define you. They pass through you, and the more you see that, the less control they have. This doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. It doesn't mean negative thoughts disappear, but it changes how deeply they affect you. Instead of pulling you in completely, they begin to lose their grip. And that's where something unexpected starts to emerge. A sense of calm, not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer completely entangled in every mental reaction. You begin to respond instead of react, and that shift, even though it's quiet, starts to reshape everything around you. As this awareness deepens, you might start to notice something even more uncomfortable. Some of the thoughts you've trusted the most are the ones that limit you the most, not in obvious ways. They don't always sound negative. Sometimes they sound logical, responsible, even protective. They tell you to stay where it's safe, to avoid risks, to not draw attention, to not try too hard. And for a long time that feels reasonable, until you begin to see the pattern. These thoughts don't just protect you, they restrict you. They keep your world small, predictable, controlled. And while that might reduce discomfort in the short term, it quietly builds something else over time. A sense of being stuck. You might not even realize it at first. It shows up as a subtle frustration, a feeling that something isn't quite right, that you're capable of more, but something keeps holding you back. And when you look closer, it's often the same internal voice, the same quiet limits. This isn't for you. You'll probably fail. It's better not to try. But here's the shift. Once you've created that distance between you and your thoughts, these messages start to look different. They no longer feel like absolute truths. They start to feel like suggestions, ones you don't necessarily have to follow. And that realization can feel both freeing and unsettling. Because if those limits aren't real, then what is? It means there's more flexibility than you thought, more possibility. But it also means responsibility. You can't blame everything on circumstances or on who you thought you were. You have choices, and that's where things become real. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real. You start to experiment, small changes, slightly different reactions. Moments where you choose not to follow the familiar script. And sometimes nothing bad happens. Sometimes things actually improve, and that creates a new kind of evidence. Not based on fear, but on experience. Slowly, your trust begins to shift, not toward every thought, but toward your ability to observe, choose, and adapt. And that's where a different kind of confidence begins to form. Not loud, not forced, just steady, the kind that grows quietly without needing to prove itself. At this point, something deeper begins to unfold. It's no longer just about your thoughts, it's about how you see yourself. Because for a long time, your identity has been shaped by those internal patterns. The way you describe yourself, the roles you believe you fit into, the limits you assume are part of who you are. But now those definitions start to feel less solid. Not because you've lost yourself, but because you're seeing how much of that self was built from repeated ideas, not conscious choice. And that can feel disorienting. When old labels begin to fade, there's a moment where you don't immediately replace them. You're not rushing to become someone new. You're simply noticing that you're not as fixed as you once believed. And in that space, something important happens. You become more present. Instead of constantly referencing who you think you are, you start responding to what's actually happening. You listen more closely. You react less automatically. You allow situations to unfold before deciding how to engage with them. And that changes your experience of life in subtle but meaningful ways. Conversations feel different. Decisions feel clearer. Even challenges begin to lose some of their intensity. Not because they disappear, but because you're not amplifying them through constant mental resistance. There's less internal noise, not silence, but less chaos. And in that quieter state, you begin to notice things you missed before. Opportunities, nuances, small details that were always there, but were overshadowed by constant mental commentary. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming aware. And awareness has a way of simplifying things, not by removing complexity, but by allowing you to navigate it without unnecessary confusion. You begin to trust your responses more, not because they're always right, but because they come from a clearer place. Less influenced by fear, less driven by automatic patterns, more grounded. And that grounded feeling doesn't need validation. It doesn't need constant reassurance. It just exists, quietly supporting your actions. And over time, that quiet support becomes something you can rely on. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to change how you move through the world. Eventually, you reach a point where the question is no longer, "Are these thoughts mine?" The question becomes, "What do I choose to do with them?" Because by now you've seen enough to understand that thoughts will always come and go. Some helpful, some not. Some clear, some confusing. That part doesn't change. What changes is your role in relation to them. You're no longer just reacting. You're participating. And that shift is where real change begins, not in a dramatic, life-altering moment, but in small, consistent choices. Choosing not to follow a familiar negative pattern. Choosing to pause instead of react. Choosing to act based on clarity instead of impulse. These choices might seem insignificant at first, but they accumulate. And over time, they begin to reshape your experience in ways that feel natural, not forced. You start to notice that you're less affected by things that used to overwhelm you. Situations that once triggered strong reactions now feel manageable, not because you've become indifferent, but because you're no longer automatically pulled into every mental loop. There's more stability, more space, and with that space comes a different kind of freedom. Not the kind that removes challenges, but the kind that allows you to face them without losing yourself in the process. You begin to live with more intention, not constantly analyzing everything, but simply being aware enough to choose your direction instead of drifting with every thought. And that awareness doesn't isolate you. It connects you more deeply to your own experience, to your decisions, your actions, your life. It's quiet, subtle, almost invisible from the outside. But internally it changes everything. Because for the first time you're not just living inside your mind, you're seeing it, and that changes the way you see everything else.